She was 17 years old, and she had exactly one trunk, one wool coat, and nowhere in the world that would call itself her home. Her name was Josephine Ror, and the man who put her out onto the road was her own stepfather, Garrett Voss, who told the whole town of Millhaven Crossing that she had grown too willful, too prideful, too much her mother's daughter to remain under his roof a single night more. She left, with $11 folded into her glove and a locket she dared not sell, and within the month she spent nearly every cent of it, $9, on a condemned ferry depot sinking slowly into the mud of the Kettle River, a building the county itself had marked for demolition. Men on the landing laughed at her, called it a fool's purchase, a plank house fit only for rot and river rats. They did not know that beneath its rotted loading dock lay something two families had bled and buried and lied over for 30 years, something that would surface at last only because a girl with nothing left to lose was foolish enough, or brave enough, to go looking. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Josephine Ror. If you have ever been sent away from a place that should have kept you, tell us in the comments where you found the courage to build again. Josephine Ror had been born in 1859 on the banks of the Kettle River, in the small but proud shipping town of Millhaven Crossing, Minnesota Territory, at a time when the river itself was the only road that mattered, and the ferry that crossed it was the town's beating heart. Her father, Michael Ror, had not owned the ferry, but he had built and maintained its landing dock for the better part of 2 decades, a trade he had learned from his own father in Galway before the family crossed the ocean. And he was, by every account Josephine ever heard as a girl, the finest dock carpenter on that stretch of river, a man who could read the swell and drag of water the way other men read scripture. Her mother, Brigid, kept a small dry goods stand near the landing, selling ribbon and tobacco and hard candy to travelers waiting on the ferry. And it was there, among barrels and coiled rope and the constant creak of the loading planks, that Josephine spent her earliest years learning 2 things that would matter more than she could have known: the particular language of wood and water that her father spoke fluently, and the quiet, careful bookkeeping her mother insisted on, down to the last penny, because Brigid Ror had grown up poor in Ohio and never trusted a household that did not know exactly what it owned. The ferry itself, called the Kettle Bell, was jointly owned in those years by 2 families whose names still meant something in Millhaven Crossing when Josephine was a girl: the Averys and the Hollisters. A partnership struck in 1848 when both families had pooled what little capital they possessed to build the first reliable crossing on that stretch of river, splitting ownership and profit precisely down the middle. An arrangement that had made both families comfortable and, for a time, close as kin. Josephine's father worked for both of them without favor, and she remembered, as a small child, evenings when Elias Avery and Thaddeus Hollister would sit together on the landing with her father, passing a jug and arguing amiably about whether the ferry ought to be widened for wagon freight. And it seemed to her then that the 2 families were bound as tightly as the ropes that held the Kettle Bell to her moorings. Her father used to tell her, while teaching her to drive a peg true into seasoned oak, that a good partnership was like a good joint in timber. It held not because nothing pulled against it, but because both sides were shaped to bear the strain together. She did not understand, at 8 or 9 years old, how much weight that lesson would one day be asked to carry. The partnership between the Averys and the Hollisters began to splinter, as Josephine later pieced together from fragments overheard in her childhood and confirmed only many years afterward, sometime around 1866. When the railroad survey crews began moving through the territory, and it became clear that whichever family controlled the eventual rail crossing point on the Kettle River stood to gain a fortune far beyond anything the ferry alone could provide. What had been an amicable partnership curdled, over the following years, into a quiet and increasingly bitter rivalry. Each family maneuvering to buy up land near the most likely crossing points. Each family growing more guarded and less generous toward the other. Until by the time Josephine was 10 years old, Elias Avery and Thaddeus Hollister no longer sat together on the landing at all, and her father found himself, uncomfortably, caught in the middle of two men he had once counted as friends. Michael Rourke kept his own counsel through those years, doing his work honestly for both families, and refusing, as far as Josephine ever knew, to take either side, a neutrality that she would later understand had cost him more than she ever guessed at the time. Her mother died of a lung fever in the hard winter of 1871, when Josephine was 12, and her father, though he carried on, was never quite the same steady man afterward, growing quieter, more careful, more inclined to keep his own papers close and his own opinions closer. It was in this period, Josephine would later learn, that her father was entrusted by both the Avery and Hollister families with something neither fully trusted the other to hold alone, for reasons she would not understand until she was a grown woman standing in the ruin of a condemned building with a lantern in her hand. Michael Rourke died in the spring of 1874, when Josephine was 15, killed in an accident on the very loading dock he had built and maintained for 20 years, when a poorly secured freight wagon rolled and crushed him against a piling during a spring flood that had made the footing treacherous. The county called it misfortune. Josephine, in the years that followed, would come to wonder whether misfortune was truly the whole of it, though she had no proof, and for a long while no reason to look for any. With her father gone and no living relations of her own, Josephine was taken in, out of what was called Christian duty, by her mother's cousin's husband, Garrett Voss, a man who ran a modest freight forwarding business out of Millhaven Crossing, and who had married Josephine's second cousin, Ida, 3 years before. Garrett Voss was not, in the early days, an unkind man, merely a distracted and self-important one, and Josephine spent 2 years in his household doing the work of a hired girl in exchange for room and board, learning to keep quiet, keep useful, and keep her opinions to herself. Virtues that did not come naturally to a girl who had been raised by a mother who valued a woman's ledger book as much as her Bible. It was during these years, working in Garrett Voss's cramped office above the freight warehouse, that Josephine learned to read a shipping manifest, to track goods and payments, and to notice quietly the small discrepancies that appeared now and then between what Garrett claimed to have received and what actually crossed the landing, a skill she kept carefully to herself, sensing, correctly, that a girl in her position gained nothing by pointing out her guardian's arithmetic. The trouble that ended Josephine's place in the Voss household began in the winter of 1876, when Garrett Voss, deep in debt from a freight contract that had gone badly, discovered that a strong box of company funds he had been quietly borrowing against was short by a sum he could not easily explain to his creditors, and rather than admit his own mismanagement, he found it convenient to suggest, first to his wife and then to the town at large, that his 17-year-old ward had been pilfering from the household accounts she had access to as part of her duties. Josephine denied it with every ounce of dignity she possessed, and Ida Voss, to her credit, seemed for a time uncertain whom to believe. But Garrett was a man who understood, better than most, how quickly a reputation could be reshaped by a confident, repeated accusation, and within a matter of weeks the town's sympathy had settled comfortably against the orphaned girl and in favor of the respectable freight man who had so generously taken her in. Garrett put her out on a gray March morning with $11 he claimed, with evident satisfaction, was more than she deserved, and told her she was free to seek her fortune wherever a girl of her character might find one willing to have her. Josephine spent the first weeks of her exile doing what work she could find in towns along the river, taking in mending, helping at a boarding house kitchen in a settlement 2 days downstream, sleeping in barns and church vestibules when nothing better presented itself, and turning over in her mind, again and again, the unfairness of a world that had let a careless man's debts fall onto an innocent girl's shoulders simply because he was older, richer, and more believed. It was in one of these downstream towns that she heard, from a river pilot passing through, that the old ferry depot at Millhaven Crossing, the very landing her father had built and died upon, long since replaced by a newer crossing point after the railroad finally settled its route a mile upstream, had been condemned by the county and was to be sold at auction for whatever it might bring, since no one wanted the liability of a rotting structure sinking slowly into the riverbank. Something in Josephine tightened at the news, some old, unfinished thread pulling taut, and though she had barely enough money left to feed herself through the following week, she found herself walking back toward Millhaven Crossing with a determination she could not fully explain even to herself. The auction was a small, dispirited affair held on a raw April afternoon, attended mostly by men hoping to salvage lumber and iron fittings from the condemned depot before it was torn down entirely. And when the auctioneer came to the property itself, few were willing to bid on a building the county had already condemned and would soon demolish regardless of who held the deed. Josephine offered $9, nearly everything she had left in the world, and the auctioneer, eager to close the sale and move to the more valuable salvage lots, accepted with only a faint, pitying shake of his head. She heard the laughter behind her as she signed the paper, men murmuring that the Rourke girl had gone soft in the head, buying a condemned building on a river she'd been chased away from twice over. First by her father's death, and now by her guardian's lies. She did not answer them. She walked the half-mile out to the old landing alone, her trunk left behind at the boarding house until she could arrange to bring it, and stood for a long while in the fading light, looking up at the depot her father had built with his own hands, sagging now, its roof half collapsed, its loading dock jutting out over the brown spring water like the ribs of some old beached creature. She spent her first night in the depot wrapped in her coat on a section of dry floor near the old ticket window, too proud to admit to herself how frightened she was, and in the days that followed, she began the slow work of clearing debris and assessing what, if anything, of the building could be saved. It was on the 4th day, while prying loose a section of rotted decking on the loading dock itself, the very spot, she realized with a chill, where her father had died 3 years before, that her crowbar caught on something that was not simply waterlogged timber. Beneath the decking, she found a section of the dock's understructure built differently than the rest. Heavier, more deliberately framed, with a small iron-banded hatch set flush into the pilings just above the waterline, hidden from any casual eye by a lattice of crossbeams that looked, at first glance, like ordinary bracing. It took her the better part of a day, working carefully so as not to weaken the pilings further and send the whole structure into the river, to work the rusted hatch free. And when she finally lowered a lantern down into the dark space beneath, she found a narrow, dry compartment, kept dry, she would later understand, by clever drainage channels her father had built into the pilings themselves, containing a single oilcloth-wrapped bundle and a small, heavy strongbox stamped with 2 sets of initials she recognized at once, A for Avery and H for Hollister. Josephine carried the bundle and the box up into what remained of the depot's old office and worked by lantern light late into that first night to open them, and what she found inside would occupy her thoughts for the rest of her life. The oilcloth bundle contained a set of documents, partnership papers, correspondence, and a detailed, dated accounting. That told a story neither the Avery nor the Hollister family had ever spoken of publicly, at least not in Josephine's hearing. In 1868, at the height of the railroad speculation that had first cracked the two families' friendship, Elias Avery and Thaddeus Hollister had each secretly and separately approached Josephine's father, each asking him to hold, in trust and in confidence, a private fund meant to bribe the railroad surveyor, who would determine the final crossing point of the line, each man hoping to secure the rail route for his own family's land holdings at the other's expense, and each entirely unaware that the other had made the same arrangement with the same trusted dock carpenter. Michael Rourke, faced with the impossible position of holding two competing bribes from two men who trusted him precisely because he was known to favor neither, had done something Josephine found, reading it by lantern light with her father 3 years dead, almost unbearably characteristic of the man she remembered. He had accepted both funds, told each family he had delivered their bribe as instructed, and then, in fact, delivered neither. Instead, he had hidden both sums beneath the very dock he had built, along with a letter explaining his reasoning, apparently intending to return the money to both families once the railroad matter settled itself honestly, believing that the surveyor, left uninfluenced, would choose whatever crossing point best served the river and the town rather than whichever family paid the largest bribe, which was, in the end, precisely what happened. Since the rail line was ultimately routed upstream of Millhaven Crossing entirely, rendering both bribes moot, and both families, in their private shame at having attempted to corrupt the survey, never spoke to the other of the money again, each assuming, apparently, that the other had simply pocketed the loss. The strongbox itself, when Josephine finally forced its lock, contained the funds themselves, a substantial sum for the time, nearly $600 combined, untouched and forgotten for 8 years, along with her father's letter, dated only weeks before his death, in which he confessed the whole arrangement plainly and expressed his intention to return both funds openly once he found a way to do so, without further inflaming the bitterness between the two families, an intention his sudden death on that very dock had cut permanently short. Reading her father's careful, apologetic hand by lantern light, Josephine understood at last the strange, watchful caution that had marked his final years, and understood, too, with a grief that felt both old and freshly sharpened, that the money he had hidden beneath his own feet, quite literally, had likely been on his mind the very morning the freight wagon crushed him against that piling, whether from simple bad luck, as the county had ruled, or from some distraction born of the burden he carried alone. She would never fully know, though she came, in time, to suspect the timing had not been entirely accidental, since she later learned that a wagon driver employed that season by Thaddeus Hollister had been oddly quick to leave Millhaven Crossing for good in the weeks following her father's death, and had never been questioned closely about how the wagon's brake had failed to hold. Josephine did not act on her discovery immediately. She understood, with the same careful instinct that had once let her notice small discrepancies in Garrett Voss's ledgers without ever remarking on them aloud, that a 17-year-old girl with a condemned building and a strong box of old money would find herself accused of theft or fraud far more readily than she would find herself believed, particularly by two families as established and as guarded as the Averys and the Hollisters had become in the years since their falling out. She spent several careful weeks, living meagerly off what little food she could grow and gather near the depot, and what small mending work she could still find in town, quietly making the acquaintance of both families without revealing what she had found, listening to old Mrs. Avery speak with lingering bitterness of the Hollisters' supposed treachery in the railroad matter, and hearing, separately, Thaddeus Hollister's son Warren speak with equal bitterness of the Averys, each family nursing a decade-old grievance built, she now understood, on a betrayal that had never actually occurred. She learned, too, that Warren Hollister had inherited not only his father's share of a now much diminished ferry business, since the railroad's arrival upstream had gutted the crossing's importance, but also his father's suspicion and temper, and that he had in recent months begun quietly pressuring the Avery family to sell their remaining river frontage at a depressed price, using the town's declining fortunes as leverage, a scheme Josephine recognized, with a discomfort she could not shake, as bearing an uncomfortable resemblance to the way Garrett Voss had once pressured her own trust. When Josephine finally judged the moment right, she did not go to either family alone or in secret, understanding that a solitary approach would only invite suspicion of favoritism or fraud. Instead, she wrote separately to both Evangeline Avery, Elias's now elderly widow, and to Warren Hollister, asking each to meet her at the old depot on a specified afternoon regarding a matter of importance concerning their fathers. A request neither could quite bring themselves to refuse. Curiosity and old grief being, in the end, more powerful than pride. She arranged, too, for the town's aging notary, a careful and well-respected man named Judge Aldous Penny, who had known both families and her own father for 30 years, to be present as a witness, sensing correctly that whatever unfolded that afternoon would need an unimpeachable third party to lend it credibility. When Evangeline Avery and Warren Hollister arrived, separately and warily, at the ruined depot, each visibly startled to find the other present, Josephine laid her father's letter and the accounting papers before them on an old crate that served as her table, and let them read, in Michael Rourke's own careful hand, the truth neither family had ever suspected, that their fathers had each secretly attempted to corrupt the same survey, that neither had succeeded, that the money they believed lost to a dishonest carpenter had in fact been faithfully preserved for 8 years beneath the very dock where he died protecting it, and that the bitterness which had poisoned both families for a decade rested on nothing more solid than a shared, unspoken shame that neither had ever confessed to the other. The reaction, as Josephine had feared it might, was not immediately one of gratitude. Warren Hollister, quicker to anger than his late father had been, accused Josephine outright of forging the documents to extract money or sympathy from two families with far more standing than her own, and suggested, with an ugliness that reminded her painfully of Garrett Voss, that a girl already once accused of theft ought not to be trusted with a story so convenient to her own circumstances. It was Evangeline Avery, to Josephine's quiet relief, who first recognized her late husband's handwriting on a separate note tucked within the bundle, a note Elias Avery had evidently included when he first entrusted his funds to Michael Rourke, apologizing in advance for the secrecy of the arrangement and asking that, should anything befall him, the money be returned to his family with his contrition. A note whose ink and hand Evangeline confirmed without hesitation, her voice breaking as she did so, since she recognized in her husband's careful apology the same private shame she herself had long carried, but never spoken of, having suspected, though never proven, that Elias had once considered exactly such a bribe. Judge Penny, examining both sets of handwriting against old land office records he had access to, confirmed within the week that the documents were genuine beyond reasonable dispute. And Warren Hollister, faced with his own father's initials stamped plainly on the strongbox, and a private letter in the Avery family's possession that corroborated every detail, found his accusations of fraud collapsing beneath him rather more quickly than Josephine's reputation ever had beneath Garrett Voss's lies. What followed was not a swift or dramatic reconciliation, but the truth rarely restores what it breaks all at once. Over the following months, with Judge Penny mediating and Josephine present at every meeting as the keeper of her father's honest account, The Avery and Hollister families slowly untangled the decade of bitterness that had grown from a mutual, unconfessed shame, and agreed, at last, to split the recovered $600 in the same equal partnership their fathers had originally intended for. The ferry itself, using the funds not to enrich either family individually, but to establish a small trust for the maintenance of the Kettle River landing, and, at Josephine's quiet insistence, for the support of dockworkers' families left without means in the event of accident or death. A fund she asked be named, simply, for her father, Warren Hollister, chastened by how close his own temper had come to burying a truth that might have healed his family's oldest wound, dropped his pressure campaign against the Avery family's river frontage entirely. And in a gesture Josephine had not anticipated, but received with quiet grace, both families together purchased the condemned depot from her at a fair price far beyond the $9 she had paid, using the building's honest sale to formally restore to Josephine Ror the dignity and independence that Garrett Voss's lies had stolen from her 3 years before. Garrett Voss himself, whose earlier accusation against Josephine became known once more through the renewed local interest in the Rourke family's history, found his own freight business quietly and permanently avoided by both the Avery and Hollister interests once the truth of his fabricated theft charge came to light through Judge Penny's careful inquiries, a punishment far gentler than the one he had once inflicted on a 17-year-old girl, yet one that cost him, over the following years, nearly everything his reputation had been built upon. And so we return to where this story began, to a girl of 17 thrown out onto a gray road with $11 and no one left to call family, and to the young woman who walked back to the river that had taken her father and bought, for $9 desperate, the one condemned building no one else believed was worth saving. Josephine Ror never set out to reconcile two feuding families or to clear her father's quiet, complicated name. She set out only to stand once more on the ground where she had been happiest as a child, trusting, perhaps without fully knowing why, that her father's care for that landing had not simply rotted away with the timber. What lay beneath that loading dock did more than silence the whispers that had followed her. It proved that Michael Rourke's final, quiet act of honesty, offered to two men who trusted him precisely because he judged neither above the other, had waited patiently in the dark for 8 long years for someone worthy enough and stubborn enough to bring it back into the light. Thank you for spending this time with Josephine Ror and the depot that gave her back far more than it ever cost her. If her story touched something in you, please consider sharing it with someone who needs to be reminded that what the world condemns is not always beyond saving. Before you go, we would love to hear from you. What is a time you found value in something everyone else had already given up on? Tell us in the comments below. Until next time, stay close.